mention a friend of Tom's, a good friend, Steve Saunders' nephew, Doug Saunders, passed away suddenly on Friday. So remember that family, 41 years old, I believe. So remember that family, the Saunders family.
We are thankful for the rain and just the pretty week we had. Some really hot days this week, but we're thankful for the time to be outside and just see things grow, and we're just appreciative of all that. Today, we're going to get back we don't really talk about sacrifices, but just a teeny bit, but we're going to get back on that just a little bit today. Our lesson title is David's Sacrifice, and our background in our introduction talks about the bubonic plague, and it said an estimate was that 1/3 of the people in Europe died within 5 years during that, and it says at the time they couldn't explain that, so many people believed it was God's punishment for the corrupt lifestyles of Christians and the church's tolerance of sin. And then it said that just turned into all kinds of other things. But it said now, and most recently here, of course, we had the 1918, not recently, great influenza pandemic, the 1980s AIDS epidemic, and the COVID-19 in 2020. And it's kind of funny to think now that that's been 5 years, isn't it, since that came on. But it says some perceived that was also punishment by God for societal sins. And it says those who saw these health crises that way proclaimed justification from Scripture. But it says well known are the 10 plagues that inflicted the people of Egypt, but most, if not all, don't fit our usual understanding. The word plague is referring to a disease resulting from bacterial or viral infection, but those plagues were the frogs and all that. I know that I enjoy doing talking to the kids, or they kind of get a lot out of that because the sensationalism of all these frogs and all this stuff. But today we're going to talk about God's punishment that takes place during the reign of Israel's greatest leader, King David. And our lesson context says that David was being portrayed as a man after God's own heart, but we often remember, and many sermons are often, different preachers preach on David's adultery and his sin, and then, the death of their child and all that, and that yet and still, how many of us love so many Psalms, but it just puts it in perspective that we're just human, and everybody can fail, and everybody can trust. We can do that. We can fail quite easily, but we can also trust in the God who made us, just like our parents. So often, a parent will stand by their children when other people won't, and because they believe in the good in them. And this morning, I heard a preacher was speaking this morning. It was Matthew's church, and they were speaking to the children, and he was talking about Zacchaeus and how, they didn't like him because he was a tax collector, and he did steal some money from some people. But Jesus said, "Come here, I'm going to hang out with you," and how he loved him and saw the good in him. And he said that's what God does for all of us. When he sees the good in us, then we respond by changed lives and by trusting in him. But we're going to look a little bit at what the punishment was, though. Even though we hold David up, there was a punishment, and it's really quite severe, I think. I mean, it should be. But it's just when you think in terms of being a person who lived at that time and what they had to go through because of his sin. So let's look at that. It says, I'm going to go back and look at 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and read just a little bit, because our book picks up in 14, but I'm going to read the verses before that. It says, Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the troops, go count the Israelites from Beersheba to Dan, then report back to me so that I may know how many there are. But Joab replied, may the Lord multiply his troops 100 times over. My lord the king, are they not all my lord's subjects? Why does the Lord want to do this? Why should he bring guilt on Israel? The king's word, however, overruled Joab. So Joab left and went throughout Israel and then came back to Jerusalem. Joab reported the number of the fighting men to David. In all Israel, there were 1,100,000 men who could handle a sword, including 470,000 in Judah. But Joab did not include Levi and Benjamin in the numbering because the king's command was repulsive to him. This command was also evil in the sight of God, so he punished Israel. Then David said to God, I have sinned greatly by doing this. Now I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. So in doing this, asking for this census to find out, how many, I thought that was a bunch of people that could handle the sword. I mean, how many more other people were there? But it says it was his pride, and he just wanted to bring this out. And it says, the prophet Gad delivered God's judgment to David, and it came with a twist. David could choose among 3 punishments of varying impacts on Israel for his sins. He could choose 3 months of attacks by the nation's enemies, 3 years of famine, or 3 days of a pestilent plague. The 3 have been ways God had showed his wrath to Israel. David chose the 3rd option with horrific results for his people. So then we go into the scripture. So we're in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, now verse 14. It says, so the Lord sent a plague on Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell dead. So the plague that he sent on them, it says, was labeled earlier as the sword of the Lord. It says, although not described, the implication is that of a fast-moving malady that kills quickly. And so 70,000 died immediately. And just think about that. And it says it was the plague reached from Dan to Beersheba, a straight line distance of about 150 miles, encompassing the whole of Israel. In the small geographic footprint of David's realm, every village and every citizen would have felt lost because of these deaths. The sorrowful outcry from survivors would have been deafening and impossible for the king to ignore. I mean, think about that. If it was in just a small community and all these people died, like your family and your cousins and everybody's family might be affected with at least one death or whatever, depending on how many there were. But it was just such a sorrowful, hard time, and even though he chose this, it had a very sweeping effect on the people, and they died because of David being prideful in doing this census. And we think about how we talk about senseless deaths, and like in a school shooting or just somebody senselessly taking somebody's life, or in even an accident. But just think about that, all that, and they'd say, well, I mean, and everybody would know that it was his fault. Think about that if you had to live through that. It says the Bible explains how God used floods, plagues, locusts, and invading armies to express his displeasure with sinful people. But he wasn't expressing his anger merely to blow off steam. Instead, he was instigating change from sinful behavior to godly behavior. And when disasters have happened since the 1st century AD, some people will attribute it to God's wrath. But that's just speculation. It says, if a given disaster is actually a divine punishment or simply an event that God allows to occur, It says, but we do know that change follows disasters. Think of the societal changes since the pandemic here. And then in my thinking about that, I thought we were having some discussion on that. Because, of course, I hate to talk about social stuff. But I mean, if we talked about what changed since COVID, I don't think as soon as COVID happened, in my thinking, we've made a big turnaround to do better. It seems like a lot of the really things that really happened since then, it's just gotten worse. It's like we almost turned more sinful in our country or whatever. We didn't say, oh, we're going to do better or whatever because all these people have died. It seems like if we just think about the different changes and how we just turned so totally away from God in so many ways since that time. So I don't think it affected us enough to make a good change, but we hope now we're seeing some changes, but I think immediately after, or maybe during that year and the next year and whatever, we didn't see a lot of good change. We saw more bad change, but that's me. Does anybody else have an opinion on that? Or you might not want to talk about it, but I just think, in thinking about that, but it says, anyway, it says, when we face personal disaster, we might worry that God is punishing us. It's more valuable, however, to focus on what change will follow. And a lot of times you'll hear somebody say, well, that was meant to happen for a reason. And a lot of times they say that if something happens to somebody, and then they say, but see, so-and-so, they got saved or whatever, after something happens. And that is the result. We want to see the good change with people turning back to God and worshiping and being in his house. And, because we've talked about it a lot of times, that because COVID told us not to come to church, during, not COVID itself, but because of the mandates, that took so many people out of church that haven't even come back yet, and those kind of things. But anyway, it says, remember the example of Job, who lost everything through no fault of his own while remaining faithful. God is more able to bless us in the aftermath with even more than we lost, and he is. And we just have to trust God for that. Let's look in 15. It said, and God sent an angel to destroy Jerusalem. But as the angel was doing so, the Lord saw it and relented concerning the disaster and said to the angel who was destroying the people, enough, withdraw your hand. So it's saying here that while this was occurring, the Lord relented. And it says it doesn't mean that God had been doing something wrong, but that God changed the course of what was to happen next. It said the word disaster in this context refers to due punishment, not as much as like a flood or something like that. In 15b, it says the angel of the Lord was then standing at the threshold of Arana, the Jebusite. Did I say that right? I was going, yeah, Arana, just pronounce it that way. And so here's the threshing floor. When I think about that, I always just think about the story of Ruth, don't you? And how they told her to go sleep on the threshing floor and all that. But it says a threshing floor was a flat, hard piece of ground, ideally one of stone. And in my mind, I thought it was kind of like in a building or something. And I mean, it still could be. But it says every harvest, the dried bundles of grain would be threshed there. So you wanted it to be hard because they was trying to beat out the good parts. It says this process involved laying the grain out and having it beaten or trampled by oxen to separate the ripened seeds from the stalks. And I thought a lot about that because have you ever had a cow step on your foot? I mean, but have you ever looked at a cow's foot very closely? I mean, they're not real clean. I mean, they step in all kinds of stuff. And I don't know what they did, if they'd take them and wash them and take them there. I don't know. I just had to think about being out in the pasture with my cows, or our cows. But anyway, that's how they did it. I would love, I guess you could look it up and watch a video of how they did this. I don't know. They probably didn't have one. But I'd like to see that done, wouldn't you? I mean, imagery in my mind, it just kind of went crazy on that. It says, but it's trampled to separate the ripened seeds. And you think about these little seeds and how did they separate all that and then get it to make their wheat and then grind, their flour, to grind the grains to be made into flour. It says, a threshing floor was thus an essential piece of food production that would last from harvest to harvest. Threshing floors are mentioned dozens of times in the Bible. And then it was saying that this guy that was there, it says he was a Jebusite who owned this floor. It says Jebusites were mentioned over 40 times in the Old Testament, but they were not Israelites. They were one of the tribes inhabiting the Promised Land that the Israelites were commanded to drive out. But see, they still had some there. It said they lived in Jerusalem, and apparently David let some of them stay after he conquered the city. And Araunah's presence after David's takeover indicates that he had favor with the Israelite conquerors. So he was still there. And it said, David looked up in verse 16a. David looked up and saw the angel of the Lord standing between heaven and earth with a drawn sword in his hand extended over Jerusalem. Can you imagine how that would be if you looked up and saw something like that? And it says, if you compare that in 1 Chronicles to 2 Samuel, so much of those scriptures tell the same things, maybe just a little differently. Well, it's kind of like the Gospels, I guess, in a way. I thought, well, that's strange they do that twice, but the Gospel, they do a lot of it 4 times, don't they? But it says the most obvious difference is one of length. This part of the story is about twice as long in our lesson text other than in the parallel verses in Samuel. It says the parallel verse merely says, when David saw the angel who was striking down the people. So he didn't say it was standing between heaven with a sword drawn with all those details that would go into your mind. It just said the angel was striking down the people. So it didn't give a lot of context clues for us to get a good visual picture of what was going on. In 16b, when he saw that, it said, then David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell face down. So this is the reason they had the sackcloth on was because they were mourning about all these people that died. Because it's supposed to be 3 different things happen. And I guess that was the first one. And this might be starting the second one or whatever. But they put that on. They didn't wear their fancy robes and all this when they were mourning. And it said it would truly be the exact opposite of their fine garments. They put this on when they were mourning, like how sometimes people wear black or like that for funerals. They also really took it down from the glorious clothing to the sackcloth. And it says the combined aspects of wearing sackcloth and falling face down are rare. And it indicates the extreme nature of the situation at hand, because they were all mourning because all these people had died. And then he just fell face down wearing it. It made me, let's see, I was trying to think. He said it was a rough, loose-fitting cloth like modern burlap. And I thought, well, now, one time when we was in school, we did some kind of play, and we put on burlap sacks. Our mamas made it where we wore it for this play, and I still can't remember. I don't know why I can't. I always remember good stuff like that. But why I can't remember why we wore the burlap sacks, but they didn't feel good. Even with, I think Mama even put a lining, but when your arms rub the outside, it's just itchy, especially the burlap, the way it is. So I thought about that, and I'm sure part of the reason they wore that kind of cloth and it was, rough was because they didn't want to be comfortable as they were mourning. They wanted a constant reminder of the sorrow that they were thinking about. I really think that's what it was. That's just my opinion. But anyway, they put this on, and then it says, David, in verse 17, David said to God, was it not I who ordered the fighting men to be counted? I, the shepherd, have sinned and done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Lord my God, let your hand fall on me and my family, but do not let this plague remain on your people. So he doesn't dodge the bullet or anything and say, well, what, it really wasn't my fault. I was just trying to be sure we had enough, troops and everything. And I didn't realize it was going to cause all this. Have you ever heard somebody say that? Well, I didn't know that was going to happen. And they just kind of dodge around the fact that something they did really did just cause a bunch of mess to happen. And so David, he takes responsibility, and it says both in Samuel and in Chronicles where we're reading, it says both stress David's confession that he and he alone was responsible for the unholy census he had taken. And his advisor had warned him against doing that, but it said he even left one tribe uncounted because he didn't want to tell him all that, and he didn't think they ought to be doing it. But it says, even so, David seemed quite willing to admit his sin and repent. When God confronted Adam with his sin in the garden, he attempted to shift the blame to his wife. When Samuel rebuked Saul for disobedience, that king made excuses, and David did neither. And it says, and as he did when confronted with his sin concerning or regarding Bathsheba, David took sole responsibility. And our book points out something I think is kind of probably hard for all of us. It says, what are some ways to take responsibility for something wrong that you've done? A lot of times we just want to brush it aside, but maybe that's the thing that when you wake up in the night sometimes and you get it on your mind or whatever, and you think, well, I should have done that a different way or handled that a better way or whatever. But it says, how should your prayers be the same or different from what David prayed? But, I think when he says, I think it's hard for us to say, punish me accordingly, God, for what's happened, because we think about forgiveness and we think about asking for forgiveness, but there are consequences to all things. So, in thinking about being truly sincere like David was here and seeing that all this had been caused just because of something he did, that's a lot to carry. I think a lot of people, who maybe take their life or something just feel like they can't bear anymore to carry what's on them that they know they did or whatever. In the verse 18 it says, then the angel of the Lord ordered Gad to tell David to go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So he told him, it says, he made his expectations clear. In other words, it wasn't just David praying to God. God sent somebody to tell him. Just like, he sent somebody when it was his sin with Bathsheba. He sent somebody to point it out to him. And that time, he was doing this little roundabout story. And David realized he was talking, about him. But it says he sent somebody. It says this man is elsewhere referred to as a prophet, as a seer, and as both. But for David to go up means that it was a bit of an uphill hike to be part of this task that he told him to do. In other words, he literally was going up higher to higher ground to get to this threshing floor place. And he's got to go do it. And think about it, the threshing floor is very important to them because that's how they separate the stuff to get their flour, and they have to eat. And now David's got to go up there and do something else. So let's read about that. So in 19 it says, so David went up in obedience to the word that Gad had spoken in the name of the Lord. And it says David realized that Gad was not offering his expert opinion when he told him to do this. He realizes that Gad was speaking from what God told him to say. And it says it was obedience. Went up, it says, indicates complete obedience. The Lord had chosen a specific site. It's noted in 2 Chronicles 3:1 That place was Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David on the threshing floor. It says the threshing floor was to become the site of Solomon's temple, and Moriah was the place where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son Isaac. So let's look at 20 and 21. It says, while Araunah was threshing wheat, he turned and saw the angel. His 4 sons who were with them hid themselves. Then David approached, and when Araunah looked and saw him, he left the threshing floor and bowed down before David with his face to the ground. Now he recognizes that this is the king who has come, and they're in their kingdom. He was the king. I'm not talking about like the king is coming when we talk about God. It says this seems to have been a work day for Araunah and his 4 sons. As they were threshing wheat, they perhaps didn't notice at first the presence of the angel. But it says, we can scarcely imagine the shock of turning around and seeing the angel and the king, because he wouldn't expect the king to come in there and watch him thresh wheat. And then the king's wearing sackcloth, and all that, but during this time of sorrow for so many people. But anyway, David said to him, let me have the site of your threshing floor so I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped. Sell it to me at the full price. So he goes there, but he don't say, now look, I'm the king, and God told me that I got to make a sacrifice, so I got to have this threshing floor, and you just let me, clear out and let me build this altar. He don't do that. He offers to pay what it's worth to get it. He's not using his power as a king to just take it to make what God has told him to happen. David, is sacrificing by paying as well as what he's going to do for God. I mean, it's not just a simple thing. I mean, I kept thinking while I was reading this, I don't know why, because it don't really say anything about it in here, of how simple we say it is for us to ask forgiveness for our sins. But how maybe, we're not so obedient or clearly obedient that we don't realize what we give up in order for God to give us what he gives us. I think that's why a lot of times when we have all these songs about give all of me and let me give my whole self to you and my whole heart to you. I had that verse this week in the devotions I've been looking at for May. But we got to give it all. So let me go ahead and finish. But then Araunah said to him, take it, let the Lord the king do whatever pleases him. Look, I will give the oxen for burnt offerings, the threshing sledges for the wood, and the wheat for the grain offering. See, remember all them different offerings we talked about? I will give all this. I'll just go ahead and read on. And it says, but King David replied to Araunah, no, I insist on paying the full price. I will not take for the Lord what is yours, or sacrifice a burnt offering that costs me nothing. So he knows he's going to pay. So David put Araunah 600 shekels of gold, paid him 600 shekels of gold for the site. And they talk in our book, if you have time to read, about the equivalent of that in this day. And in 26 it said, David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. He called on the Lord, and the Lord answered him with fire from heaven on the altar of burnt offerings. Then the Lord spoke to the angel, and he put his sword back into its sheath. And at that time, when David saw that the Lord had answered him on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, he offered sacrifices there. The tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the wilderness, and the altar of the burnt offering were at that time on the high place at Gibeon. But David could not go before to inquire of God, because he was afraid of the sword of the angel of the Lord. So read on in that and look at the prayer and think about what it says there, that we, like David, are imperfect servants because of our sins. And the thought to remember is our sin affects others. Y'all have a good week.
Caden, how many verses are we gonna do on that song?
Yeah.
I'll tell Randy, he'll kinda help. You wanna do all three of them?
Yeah.
All right.
I wrote it down. Are you ready for the day trip? Getting up. I'm going, but the bad thing is I just don't want to wake up at 4 o'clock to get to school at 5. Now am I just going to sit up there with you? Or wait, what am I? I'll say my part up there and then I'll go down with you and sit. Josie, are you just trying to break everything? Why are you coming on this side? Shut up. Where is mine? Nobody's doing help. Jack, quit crashing out. Oh my gosh. Where'd you go? You don't know where he's going.
We'll make it through there.
Okay. Okay. Why are you on the girl side?